Hi, good evening.
Hey there.
We go and get started in the interest of time. Want to thank our planning commissioners for coming this evening. Welcome to our public that's attending tonight, and also online, we have some citizens that are listening in. We will have one of our commissioners, Commissioner Mach, will be online at some point as well, and I know we're still waiting for a couple to come in. But thanks again for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I'm sure some of you have missed your holiday parties. I don't know which one's better, but I think this is definitely the one. Just a reminder, this is the second workshop, as I said. So your first one, if you remember correctly, you went through the overview and the context for the actual plan, how it's going to work, and talk about the context areas and the place types. And tonight we're moving on to chapter 4 and 5, the inland context area and the coastal context area. Your next two meetings will be in January 9th and January 30th. Tonight we have the room until 8 o'clock. You can take as much time as you need. Get out of here a little early, stay a little late, whatever you'd like to do. But again, we welcome discussion, comments with our commissioners, and of course, Kristen Clare, our consultant. And I think that's probably about it for now. I'll chime in at some point, but we'll go ahead and get started.
Good evening. Last time the clicker didn't work for me, so let me just make sure. There we go.
There we go. There you go.
All right, again, my name is Kristen Clare and Renaissance Planning Group, and we'll go ahead and just get started. And again, as Kathy said, any questions that come up as we go through the presentation, just raise your hand or someone will get my attention, and I'll be glad to stop and answer your question at that time. So feel free to jump in. As Kathy said, last time we got together, we talked about chapters 1 and 2. We'll come back to get your comments on this in just a minute. But tonight I'm going to start with just an overview of what we're doing, and then focus is going to be on chapter 4 and chapter 5. Those two chapters are part of 7 chapters that are planned. The first is overview, context, goals, and big ideas, place types, policy, and design guidelines of chapter 2. Environment and open space is chapter 3. Tonight we'll be talking about the inland and coastal context areas. Next time we get together, we'll be talking about the courthouse and rural context areas. So I want to just start with the big ideas, keep ourselves grounded in the big ideas that really emerged out of the focus group discussions that we had way back, I think about a little bit over a year ago. And these are tangible things that the city can do to advance the goals, big initiatives the city can do to advance the goals. And you'll see these big ideas percolating through the plan as you read the plan, as we're putting it together. The first big idea is the environmental framework, which is to tie together, to protect the existing open spaces and natural lands within the city, and then find ways to tie those lands together to create connected natural habitats. And that's not only important for wildlife migration, but it's important for flood protection, which is a big issue in the city. But it also provides opportunities for recreation. And the linear park system is the second big idea that came out of this. It can fit within the environmental framework as it's getting established. And it's a citywide system of parks and walking trails and biking trails. Context areas helped organized the plan. And it really is, they're organized around the green line and the blue line. Because there's a limited amount of open space north of the green line where the city can grow, how the city grows is going to have to be different than how it's grown in the past. So the next big idea is centers and multimodal corridors to direct growth into those areas. And we'll be talking a lot about that tonight. Community identity and connections. When we were talking to people in the focus groups, people really wanted not only to be able to walk and use their bikes to places beyond the neighborhoods, but they were really intrigued by the idea of community hubs and having community identity in places that they could go to. We'll be talking about this a little bit more tonight as well. And then what was really important as we went through the focus groups was neighborhood well-being. So the context areas, as Kathy was mentioning, there's 4 of them. The coastal and the inland context areas are north of the green line. Courthouse context areas between the green line and the blue line. The rural areas south of the blue line. And each one of these context areas has a different chapter within the comprehensive plan, and it's got a different set of directives and policies that are attached with each. So we're going to focus tonight on the inland context area. Just to give you some background information in terms of what's going on with land uses within the inland context area and how many people are living and working in the context area. It's less than half, about 41% of the total land area of the city is in the inland context area, but it's where almost 90% of the city's residents live. It's where 80% of the city's jobs are. So it is a place where things happen within the city. The development pattern, suburban neighborhoods predominantly, you can see on the right, about 45% of the total land area is residential. There's strip commercial development along the major roads, very auto-oriented, and that's one of the big fundamental changes that has to happen within this particular context area. The big thing, we talked about this last time, the big thing is there's limited vacant land, less than 7,000 acres of vacant land. And it's not contiguous vacant land, it's vacant land that's a little bit here, a little bit there throughout the inland area. So that's the constraint that the city is facing. You know, you have to go north of the green line, but where will that growth take place? And the vacant land just isn't there to continue growing as the city has grown in the past.
Really?
Yeah.
What did you say there's 7,000 acres of vacant land north of the green line? What is the biggest contiguous tract?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, John, but I will find that out for you.
Okay. Do you know if it's mostly comprised of acre here, acre there?
It is. I can tell you that. I just don't know the exact acreages of the biggest parcel out there.
That's it was triggered. I was just curious
Yeah.
how it was broken up.
It's 7,000 acres, but it's not acres that would be considered prime real estate by developers because it is spread throughout the area. All right, so the goals for the inland area and the big ideas that are associated with the goals. And the first is protect existing and new development from flooding, whether it's storm flooding, sea level rise flooding in the future. And to protect the natural lands and the resources within it. Even though it's very developed, there still are a lot of natural lands, there are a lot of natural resources that need to be protected. Retain existing and attract businesses, identify the economic development plan. If this is where growth is going to happen. Most of the job growth will happen in the inland context area. I'm not sure what's going on here. Did I just decline this? Yeah. Okay. Guided anticipated growth in the centers and multimodal corridors. And so last time when we were talking about the different place types. And it's the objectives and the design guidelines in those place types that help frame how the growth would happen in these centers along these corridors. We heard a lot from people about the need to be able to walk and bike and use transit in the city, have options available to them. So that is another major goal. So I said earlier, identify and brand communities and improve connections within communities, and then ensure neighborhood health, safety, and well-being.
again and see?
You're seeing what a technological whiz I really am. Where did you click?
On the basically like an center. And then that little button comes up and you can tell that it's active.
Thank you. All right, so the inland area place types. Again, last time we talked a lot about the place types, centers, special use areas, neighborhoods. And I'm going to start focusing in on centers. Now, all of the design guidelines and objectives we went through last time, so I'm not going to go through those. What I'm going to be focusing in on tonight is how those design guidelines and objectives actually play out in the inland area. So the objectives for the centers to absorb most of the city's job and housing growth through center place type design guidelines. Attract targeted businesses seeking urban settings, provide a variety of housing types available to households across all income levels. And then, as we were talking about last year, make them, put them together in a way that would eventually support transit ridership along multimodal corridors. If you remember from last time, the key design features of centers, whether it's a large, small center, is they're pretty common, which is the land use is a mix of uses, both vertical and horizontal mixing within the building and across buildings. Organization is pretty important to make these things walkable and transit oriented. First of all, have a centering around a station, a transit station, whether it's existing or potential transit station. There's a core area within a quarter of a mile. That's the optimal walk distance into the transit station once it's put together. And then the second edge zone, which is between a quarter mile and a half mile away. And then there's a hierarchy of connected streets within the center, so people can get around the center. It can organize the center. And then a system of open spaces and environmental features. Brian.
Yeah, I want to get sort of realigned with these design features again, just so we can pull that up at the same time we're looking at this information. What is the order of magnitude difference between the regional center versus the city and the local? You know, what are we looking at? You know, we have essentially in this inland area, one regional center. Is that basically 10 city centers? Or 5? What's the sense of magnitude difference?
Tell you what, let me go to the next slide, because that's going to answer your question. So a regional center, town center is your regional center. The resort area, which is not in the inland area, is your regional center. These are places that attract businesses and people from outside the region. They have a large reach beyond the city. Let me back up just a step though. The footprints for all these centers are pretty much the same. It's a quarter mile within around that transit station, a half mile in the edge zone. So the footprints are about the same. What differs between them is the intensity and the size of the buildings. That's primarily the difference.
And also, would it be the purpose of the center? So if it's regional,
Yeah,
you're trying to connect it with other regional centers.
correct.
Whereas city, it's all interconnected. It's not magnitude of size, even though we're sort of giving it the big red circle, you know.
Yeah,
Because it can be lost when you start to want to apply these examples or these renderings as something literal in a comp plan.
yeah,
It's not really your goal. You're trying to give a sense of
right.
the difference between these things. And that can be hard to grasp, you know, and keep that in mind while you're going through these sections of the comp plan. So I need that kind of, you know, realignment throughout this presentation, just to kind of reorient myself and keep it in mind.
Yeah. Those are very good points. And the maps that you're talking about, the centers are denoted in two ways. We'll get to those in just a second. One is with symbology, and I think that's what you were looking at. The big red circle appeared to be a bigger footprint, when in fact it's not necessarily a bigger footprint. It's just a greater prominence in terms of its role and the kind of development that happens within it. So I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of describing what the regional center was versus the city center. So we'll get to that in just a second, and I think good thought about geographically, how do we present that in the comprehensive plan, so. Since I'm here, I'll stay here on the center types. So again, the regional centers, there's 2 in the city that are proposed, town center and resort area. We'll talk about the resort area a little bit later on. They tend to be jobs heavy, jobs rich. They tend to be downtown kind of places, central business district kind of places in this region. Downtown Norfolk would be a regional center. Town center is another regional center. I don't think south of Hampton Roads, there are any other regional centers besides downtown Norfolk, town center and the resort area. So again, jobs heavy, but there is a mix of uses. In the core zone, the buildings can be anywhere between 6 and 20 stories high, which is the case in the town center. As Brian mentioned earlier, city center, it's oriented more to city oriented businesses and civic uses, tends to have, not necessarily, but tends to have more of a balance between jobs and housing. The buildings, both the footprint of the buildings, the lots they sit on, and the size of the buildings are not as big, 3 to 10 stories in the core zone. And then local centers really interspersed between the regional and city centers. Their locations for locally oriented businesses and civic functions. They tend to be residentially oriented, more frequent, about 3 to 6 stories in the core zone. Does that all make sense in terms of the hierarchy of center types? Okay, so this is a geographically accurate depiction of centers. What you're not picking up on this is which of these purple areas is a regional center versus which is a city center, which is a local center. And maybe we can combine the 2 in the graphic. But this gives you an accurate representation of the boundaries of the centers. And the deeper purples, it's the purple hues that you're seeing on the map. The deeper purples are the core zones, the lighter purples are the edge zones, again, the quarter mile versus the half mile. You can see they're not perfect circles on the map, and that's because existing zoning for neighborhoods is used to start pushing back on those center boundaries. So if you have a neighborhood that goes in within that half mile or quarter mile, that reduces the size of the center. So that's why you don't see perfectly geometric circles on this particular map. So there's some logic. We talked about that logic last time, but there's some logic about how we put these geographies together. The centers occur on multimodal corridors, designated multimodal corridors, not everywhere in the city. There's corridors that haven't been designated as multimodal corridors. So that's the geography of centers. And so does that all make sense in terms of what's going on? Now, the reason this is important, if you go back to the design guidelines we talked about last time, we have put together very specific, whether you're a regional center, a city center, or a local center, we have put together what design guidelines for that center should be, both in terms of what happens within the core area, that deep purple area, versus what happens in the lighter purple area, the edge area. And so that the guidelines line up with each of these purple areas that you're seeing on the map, depending on the center type, and we'll talk about those. So is that making sense in terms of how this is being organized? Okay, I'll keep moving. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that. So the design guidelines will have whether light industrial office are permitted or anticipated in those particular centers. So you have to flip back to that exact center to see what is preordained or hopeful for that particular center.
That is correct. Yeah. That's correct. So that's why chapter 2 is pretty important. It's got all of that land use information, design information, infrastructure information of each of these different places. So the first thing in the plan is we've taken the strategic growth areas, areas that have already been planned. Most of them are along Virginia Beach Boulevard, but you also have Centerville and Burke Station that have been planned off of Virginia Beach Boulevard. And we've taken the boundaries for those, the established boundaries for those SGAs, and used those to define centers mainly along Virginia Beach Boulevard. The only regional center is a portion of the Pembroke's SGA. It's the central business districts within the Pembroke SGA, which is the core waterfront and Bonnie area CBD areas. City centers are the Western Campus District in the Pembroke SGA, which is pretty much over on the Witch Duck area, Hilltop, Newtown, which is on the very western end of this, and Centerville, which is not shown on this particular map, but down on Indian River Road. The local centers that are SGAs include the Central Village, which is in between the CBD and the Western Campus in the Pembroke SGA, Rosemont, and Lynn Haven. And again, the thing to keep in mind is not only the size and intensity that is being proposed for each of these different areas, which is consistent with the plans that have already been put together. So there's consistency between these guidelines that we put together, the plans that have already been done. So there's consistency there, and what this is doing is providing a policy framework that can back up what's in those plans. So as development proposals come in, you can figure out where the development sits within these geographies and understand what design guidelines are apropos or appropriate for that particular development. Those aren't the only centers, though. There are other centers outside the SGA areas. And Brian, this is the map that you were talking about. This is just symbology. It's not the geographic size of the center. So we'll sort of work on that to avoid any kind of confusion that's out there. But you can see that the only regional center is the Pembroke area, and then there's city and local centers spread throughout the city. One of the most important things in terms of the center designation is the guide development as proposed within the center areas. So there's two options for development when they come into a center area. They can develop according to existing zoning requirements by right development. But there's going to be an encouragement for that development to start paying attention to the center place type guidelines that are in the comprehensive plan. There may be some incentives. We'll talk about that in just a second. There may be some incentives that the city may want to use to entice the encouragement. But anyway, that's the intent, is to start changing what's happening within these centers, so it's aligning with the more urban fabric that we're trying to create in these centers. As the development gets reviewed, if there's inconsistencies between what the zoning ordinance is saying versus what the design guidelines are saying, then the city will go and revisit the zoning ordinance to figure out how it could be updated to better reflect the design guidelines in the comprehensive plan. Again, the intent here is to move towards the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is laying out the aspirations. This is what we want to have happen. A lot of the implementation tools that the city is currently using will need to get updated, but that's going to take some time. So there's got to be this opportunity in the meantime to review development proposals to try to get them to align with what you're trying to do as opposed to what existing zoning allows. And again, if there's inconsistency between the two, the first order of business is to look at the zoning ordinance and figure out, okay, are there ways we can modify the zoning ordinance to better align the zoning ordinance as it currently sits with the comprehensive plan. So we're pushing forward.
So the way I hear that is that I just want to make sure I'm understanding the point. We have a comprehensive plan. If it gets adopted, we then consider rezoning to align with this comprehensive plan. We now have created non-conforming uses throughout the city. That would happen where we have properties that have been rezoned. They're not in that zone. but we want them to be. We want them to become that use in the future. So that if that use changes or is no longer grandfathered for whatever reason, they would have to come into conformance with the zoning that has been realigned. Is that fair?
Yes, so it's gonna be a step process to get you from here to where you ultimately need to go. And we'll have we have some other recommended policies in here that get at the need to go back and update the zoning to get the zoning itself. There's gonna be some tension initially, but we don't want to, the city doesn't want to get, not be able to move towards its aspirations. So that's, the by right zoning something, until you change your zoning ordinance, the by right zoning has got to be what the city will allow. But again, there's some incentives that could be used to try to get whoever's developing that property to do it in a different kind of way until the zoning gets officially up. Does that all make sense?
So then are you creating a parallel document that's showing the and the zoning so that analysis of to be aspirational and then what? So are you creating a parallel document?
Are we? Can you repeat the question? Make sure I understand it properly.
Well, and I'm, processing this all in real time as well. So I think what I'm hearing is for parts of this comprehensive plan, the aspirations, they're aspirations, but in order to make that become a reality, there are issues with our zone. And so I guess my question is then, in this process, topically, are we then creating a parallel document that will show us to create aspiration X? So,
Let me see if I can give you an example of how I think this will work. So let's say that, I'm just going to make something up, so just I could be way off base here, but let's assume that the underlying zoning for a piece of property that the developer wants to build on, it's in a shopping center, does not allow for, or has a certain parking requirement to it. You have to put 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is a pretty standard suburban development requirement. The parking requirements in the comprehensive plan, there are no parking requirements in the plan, but there's guidelines that say you don't need to provide nearly as much parking. That's the intent. And the parking that you do provide, try to provide that so that it's on the periphery of buildings, not in front of the building. So buildings can be up against the street. So if a developer comes in and says, I want to be able to do what you're proposing in the comprehensive plan, that makes a whole lot of sense to us. The city then would review that development and with the design guidelines that are in the comprehensive plan, there may be some inconsistencies with the zoning ordinance because of the parking requirements of the zoning ordinance. So then without, going through and updating the entire zoning ordinance, you would say, let's figure out how we can adjust the zoning ordinance right now, here and now, in the interim, to allow for what we're trying to do with this parking on this particular site. Ultimately, the zoning ordinance is going to have to get updated to reflect these design guidelines. But again, and that's going to take time. It's just going to take time. And what this allows the city to do is be able to review developments in a way that is consistent with where you're trying to go, and then deal with the inconsistencies on a case by case. You can't go into the zoning ordinance and do a little bit of here, a little bit of there. It's got to apply to all properties within that kind of zoning. So that's going to be the finesse that the city's going to have to use, but that's the intent. So did I answer your question?
you did, you did.
So you all will be on the front lines of this, right? So I understand this is pretty important.
You're on the front line. We're following you.
Uh-oh.
My concern isn't the black and the white, because the the by right doesn't come before us, and I'm not worried about that.
Yeah.
My concern is the conditional use permits. And I will say more than that, my concern is that a whole strip center, for example, with the big box and out parcels, doesn't typically so far get redeveloped all at once. It's
Right.
piecemeal.
Right.
So it comes before us, and we're asked to approve a conditional use permit application. And I'm torn, because I see the aspirational goals, and I see what's there now, and, you know, what do we do? Do we go towards the vision, or do we go to what's there now?
Well, to me, that's the importance of the design guidelines and the comprehensive plan. If the comprehensive plan gets adopted with the design guidelines in, it's not, first of all, it's a plan that's been approved by you all and city council. So there's precedence behind it. It's an approved document. And it gives enough, if you look at those design guidelines, it gives enough information to be able to structure a conditional use permit or whatever you do with that property in a way that's going to be consistent with the outcome that you're trying to get to. So, and I'm gonna go to the next slide and kind of talk more process with you, and then we can come back and revisit that question. So this is option one. This is option one. Option two is developer comes in and says, and this is within the SGA areas. Let me make sure I've got this right. I skipped. Okay, option two is to just go in and develop according to the place type design guidelines. Now you're starting to get into a rezoning kind of world, right? And so if a center plan has been adopted, such as an SGA plan, you review development using the plan and the design guidelines. If it has not been adopted, we talked about this last time, but there's got to be some sort of sense, and this, I think, is getting what you're concerned about, this piecemeal kind of thing that's going on. And you don't want that to happen. You want whatever's happening to fit within a larger framework where everybody's got some understanding of what's going on in that larger framework. And so last time when we were talking, I was talking about how you have these different, mainly it's infrastructure layers. And then you finally get to the building layer, but the infrastructure layer is primarily the street network that gets established to create that gridded network within the center itself. Then you got to figure out where strategically you need to put the parking, and not in front of every single building, but you got to think through where the parking is going to be. You got to think about how stormwater is going to be collected and distributed and taken out. You got to think about open spaces. So the thinking here is that whoever comes in and wants one of these redevelopments, they're embracing what is going on in the center. If a plan hasn't already been put together for that center, for that applicant to come in and generally define this is how the whole center could build itself out with all this infrastructure. And then with that information, go back in and say, this is specifically how we're going to tie in, or we're going to organize according to that infrastructure. So hopefully by doing it that way, you're putting each development into a larger context, and you can take each development as it comes in and you can start building this up in a way that makes sense ultimately. So did that make sense in terms of what we're proposing? So an out parcel, let's say. It's usually the tail wagging the dog. It's the easy pickings, right? So usually out parcels are owned by bigger entity. Sometimes not, but sometimes they are. Most times they are. So if they want to redevelop on that out parcel, then, and they want to do it, and they're somewhat embracing this idea of doing things differently.
Or not.
Or not. Then whatever they do on that piece of property, that little piece of property, has got to start adding up. It can't be done in a way that just ignores what the potential of that property is in terms of the overall center construct. So that's the goal. Yes, sir.
So I think I get what you're saying. So in that case, guess it's gonna fall on planning staff's shoulders. So that person comes in to say, we got a better idea and we'd like to do this.
Yeah.
And then we address it after they.
Yeah. And the good thing is you've got the comprehensive plan, it's got the design guidelines in there. Staff knows what those guidelines are, so they'll be reviewing against those guidelines. The developer will have clear understanding of what those guidelines entail and start making sense of how he or she can develop the property accordingly.
And Chris, I believe we've done this to a smaller extent a couple of times already in the city. You have your SGA plan for Pembroke, for instance. You have the guidelines, the vision, and then we came in with the central business core and rezoned that so that that would reflect what the picture showed and how we wanted it to grow.
So it's been done. I think having this in the comprehensive plan, I think adds, but there's consistency now going on across all centers and not just the areas that have been planned.
That's where I come across my difficulty because, you know, in essence, I didn't draw this. You know, consultant drew it. I don't know its edges really. As we sit here and I'll look at this whole thing. All these drawings are coming in, all these maps are coming in. I've not gone through the data specifically to understand why it's drawn the way it is. But if we adopt the plan and then we adopt the zoning ordinance to conform with this plan, we've now made a lot of non-conforming properties out in this. Just like the shopping center we're talking about or whatever, you know, and so that's where I'm like, how are we arriving at the width and the uses within that width? And this is coming across to us in a way as a planning commission, we know responsibly, we're passing along on a change of somebody's use of their land. And we're saying, okay, this is where we want to go. That's the disconnect for me, and that's where I don't know that we're reaching all the way to be able to figure out, you know, how this came about. And so that when we put our name on it, we know that, you know, that's where I'm still trying to find that connection, and maybe it doesn't happen until we get the entire thing. and
No,
look at it.
it's here, and let me just make sure you understand. There's planners usually don't use the word science. There's some science underlying this. And the science is trying to make places within the city, along corridors within the city, as accessible by non-auto modes as you can make them. So walking is a very short trip, half mile at most. So that starts setting that half mile edge for the entire center area. It's called transit oriented development. So it's not something that we made up, but it's something that makes sense given how people get around. So walking is extremely important, not only within a center, because you want to get as many people walking within the center as you can, go from one place within the center, rather than get in their car and drive, you know, from that store over here to the store over here that's less than a third of a mile away. We want to encourage them to walk.
I don't disagree with that
Mhm.
and that aspiration. But you know, in my drive from town center over here today, I look at the planning that's been going on here for 60 years and I see one word, convenience. You know, to get my car from here to there. And that's where we've been planning. And now we're gonna have to literally spin around and shift to things that I don't know exist, like a transit ride, you know, in the city, in a meaningful. And then how do we get those transportation means here beyond bicycle paths and walking trails and sidewalks? How do we get ourselves as a city reoriented after all this time setting up these wide roads?
So it's not, and the mistake I think that can be made is thinking that getting people to walk or use transit or bike is just a matter of putting in the right facilities. I think, as I said last time, in fact, I know I said this last time, it's how you organize development. That is the magic ingredient, and then you put together complementary transportation facilities. Let me give you a really clear-cut example of how this works. A real-world clear-cut example. So I'm old. According to my granddaughter, I'm old. My grandparents lived in Arlington. We lived up in Severna Park, Maryland. We would drive down to Arlington, and it was nothing on Wilson Boulevard. There was nothing but strip commercial shop. I remember that as a kid, because my grandfather had a parking lot somewhere on Wilson Boulevard. Back in, I think it was 1975, they were putting in the metro. And what VDOT wanted to do and the feds wanted to do is they wanted to put metro in 66 through Arlington. And the county of Arlington said, wait a minute, we don't want it there. We want it to go right underneath the city. And the county, excuse me. And VDOT and the Fed said, well, that's great. It's only going to cost you $380 million to do that, because that's the delta between putting in 66. And he said, well, we'll pay it. And a quick little story here. My son's father-in-law's mom voted for that 300. And I said, I got to talk to her. How did she have the guts to do that? Well, she's dead. So I couldn't talk to her. But if you go up there now and you look at Clarendon, poor,
Not because of that decision.
good. She died of old age. So, but anyway, so what happened, because they put in the transportation infrastructure, but they also put in the land use. They had something called bullseye zoning up in Arlington, which they defined where their stations were, they defined, the quarter mile within those stations, and they said, this is the kind of development can happen within that. So that started back, probably a development of that quarter started in the early 80s. And if you go up there now, I know Virginia Beach is not going to be Wilson Boulevard, but I also know that that's what you can do if you coordinate land use and transportation. And probably the best example for Virginia Beach to look at, there's a corridor that goes out of downtown Charlotte. It's called the Blue Line. And it's got all of this transit-oriented development along it, and it's just a vibrant, it was an old industrial area, it's turned into an extremely vibrant, walkable place. So that's what we're trying to create here. It's a place that works in terms of being able to absorb the growth that you're going to have to absorb because there's not enough vacant land, in a way that has some functionality about it. It's not just throwing some buildings here and some buildings there. It's trying to organize transportation and land use together so that you have some real, true functionality going on within the quarter. And that's what makes these things work. It's, density by itself is not going to work, but if you can organize it in a way where people can actually start walking, ultimately using transit. And there's ways you can do transit so that you don't have to make the huge investments in transit in the early time and let your development kind of grow you into transit if you decide to go in that direction.
So your point is to try to leverage that
Yeah.
with the plan,
Yes,
so that it's just an obvious solution that no one can run from, that we're going to have to do this transit system in
No.
order to make it workable.
no. It's an option that will be available to you. Whether the city decides to make the investment or not.
I'm just trying to understand the process that you're laying out. If we don't advance the transit, we get the transit potentially on the back end,
Yeah.
potentially, whatever it is.
Right.
Then what we're doing is we're leveraging our vision against the future in that sense to reach this ride on the transit. I mean, that is part of what is in this comprehensive plan.
The option is going to be available, whether the city decides to. The thing to keep in mind about this is the transit, I think, in the next 20, 30 years is going to be so much different than what we think about right now. Technologies are changing constantly. What's not changing though is how you organize people along these corridors and where they're trying to get from and going to. I can't predict what's gonna happen. The city may treat these centers and never decide to invest in transit, but at least that option will be available to the city in the future by organizing development this way. And by the way, the SGAs were designed in this way. And so the footprint has already been laid down, and what we're doing is taking that footprint and we're applying it. We're refining it within the Virginia Beach corridor, and we're applying it to other corridors in the city. So that's the goal here. I hope that makes some sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I'm just, trying to stay up with where you're taking us through this and to understand that, these have real effects on real landowners with real land, with real property rights. So I want to make sure if we're imposing a vision, that we're imposing realistic vision. And not creating conflict and troubles that, are going to be very difficult to navigate, in the future.
I think might be trying to sell the idea. And if they get an advantage out of this, maybe they get the opportunity to build different things than what the zoning says. We're not going to get convinced.
I hear you. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I need to understand it if I'm going to stand with it and behind it and be able to discuss it with someone and understand what we came about. So understanding how we drew these lines in this shape, in this fashion, in these areas is important to know and to get the backing on, because it comes all as a package wrapped in a bow. And we either take the package home or we don't. But it's hard, it's so complicated. And I appreciate you're doing a great job. I appreciate all the effort that goes into it. It's so hard. So I want to make sure that I'm doing my best to stay up what you're thinking. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. If I were in your position, I'd be wanting the same thing, so.
You're ahead of, you're ahead of my position.
But I would be asking those same questions if I were you, and because you're right, these are properties that are owned by people. And so what's the logic for doing what we're doing? And that's pretty important to, the design guidelines and how we're structuring this plan. So
I like what you said when you said that the SGAs were designed this way.
they were.
Because the SGAs have had a lot of time for testing. There's been a period to kick the tires on the SGA. And to help people understand the reference points of where we're. And so that's very useful, I think, to refer back to them.
Yeah. And just something, as we were going, having a public meeting, so something that was also, I thought, pretty interesting. I talked with at least a dozen developers. And the developers who are good at doing subdivisions pretty much said Virginia Beach is not where we're going to be. We're over in Chesapeake, we're over in Suffolk. This is not a place for us because of the lack of vacant land in Virginia Beach. And unless something starts happening south of the blue line, which is not going to happen, and we heard that loud and clear, Virginia Beach just doesn't have the room to grow. But what I did do is I talked to about 5 or 6 developers who are getting really intrigued by what's going on. They were really intrigued by the Virginia Beach Trail. They thought that was a pretty catalytic kind of investment that the city's making. Then when I started talking about, walkable centers and things like that, I mean, they understood the SGAs. So there's developers out there who are good at doing this kind of work, and I think they're finding out Virginia Beach could be a place to be. So the market is starting to pick up. How active they are, and how engaged they will be, I don't know, but at least they were really pleased that the city was thinking about these concepts because they thought that would be a good atmosphere for them to develop in.
I also liked your example from Northern Virginia that you gave about Arlington and the delta between 66 and the other location, and they chose the more expensive location. And they had the delta
Yeah,
in their mind, they understood it. One thing that I struggle to understand is we're asking someone to go and redevelop a shopping center. Are we saying dump another $150 million in irretrievable funding? You know, that goes into the price of the apartments and whatever you're developing. Than you would otherwise pay if you were in Suffolk in a green space, just taking up 100 acres, 150 acres. What are we asking people to do in taking on those projects? To try to get the dimension of it.
you're always like one step ahead of me, so here's some policies, I think.
No, I read it and I'm still behind. I mean, I read it before
Okay,
you
good.
started. Okay,
Good.
but I'm-
Like a good lawyer.
trying to catch up.
Like a good lawyer would do. I do think, this is not a must do, have to, but I think it would be really wise for the city to start understanding what the development world sees.
Mhm.
And so, you know, the policy is to, do market demand. The way a developer would do anything, they would first do the market demand study. Then they put together their pro forma, the financial feasibility based on the marketing study. And the pro forma includes how much it's gonna cost to build the building and put all the infrastructure in. So it's all the costs that are associated with the development. And I think if the city can understand, okay, is there something here in terms of market demand or the pro forma, like maybe the infrastructure costs are a little bit too high? And another example, we're doing some work down in Charleston, South Carolina. Talked to a lot of developers who are eager to do, there's a bus rapid transit system we did the TOD for the bus rapid transit system in Charleston. Developers are interested in Charleston. Charleston, you know, you all been to Charleston, it's got a pretty intense historical town, so people get it in Charleston. They get urban design. Developers are ready to take Charleston up the BRT line, but the problem they were having was the infrastructure. And they said, you know, we can even fund the infrastructure to a large degree, but how do you coordinate it? And who's going to be responsible for making sure the street network gets put in the right way? Who's going to be responsible for making sure the parking? We do it on a site-by-site basis. It may not end up the way you want it to be. So that's why that I put in that, you know, you've got to have some understanding of what the infrastructure is going to be like on an area-wide basis. But I do think that just understanding what the gaps are between financial feasibility and project actually happening, if the city can understand that dynamic, then I think the city can get in a better position in negotiating with developers about how to get things done. And it could be a strategy such as the city decides to take on building the parking. And that's been done in a lot of different places. Build the parking up front, but then sell spaces to the buildings that are coming online as they come online. So recoup the money that way. There's a lot of creative things you can do in terms of closing those gaps. But just understanding where the gaps are, I think may be pretty important. And Brian, I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
You know, it's very useful and helpful. There's just a lot of components to this. And so when we say determine the feasibility, but yet we're simultaneously passing on a plan in which we haven't run the numbers and we don't know the impacts, that's where I begin to feel at a loss to know whether these are sound decisions in my view, you know, like to have my own independent
Yeah.
assessment, it becomes very difficult to do.
no, I hear you. And I think this is one, you know, just, I can tell you it's not gonna be $150 million delta that this is, we're not proposing or not building a transit system right off the bat, or maybe ever. Just want to be clear about that.
Well, just for instance, just in a plan that was passed on Tuesday in Chesapeake, and that was in a green zone. But just to get extended water to do the utilities, the developer was putting up 25 million to the private line. in order to make that happen. And that was an area you didn't have to knock things down. You didn't have to reconfigure all the stormwater components and all the other things. We're talking, so the costs are,
Oh,
they
yeah.
can get really significant.
They can. But again, I think just having a better understanding of what that dynamic is, I think would be very helpful. I sort of jumped ahead. One of the other sets of policies is, how do you implement what's going on? And so within centers that have plans already put together, in the Pembroke SGA, there is form-based code, which is helpful. There's not form-based code, and if you all have dealt with form-based code before, this is not, some places we go to, they've never seen form-based code before, but you all have it, so you understand what it is. So probably need to think about form-based code in these other centers on the SGA areas that don't have them, and in new centers. I do think just a better understanding of infrastructure and infrastructure costs would be helpful within the centers. A lot of that information is in the SGA plans already, but if that needs to be augmented, the city may want to augment that. And then when you have new centers, this is not recommending that every single new center on that comprehensive plan have a plan put together immediately. But if there's a lot of interest in a particular center somewhere, private interest in that center, the city may want to get in partnership with the landowners or the developers within that center and say, look, let's put together a center plan for this area where we talk about how the infrastructure is going to get designed, how it's going to get paid for, and kind of work it out that way. So, so that's the option that's in front of the city, is get more information in terms upfront about what you want to do, and then go for it. So if that makes some sense. Now I'll talk to Walter Potter. I think he has some property in one of the centers. I'll talk to him about.
The Hilltop.
Yeah.
Hilltop.
So Walter and I went to school together. Yeah. All right, so those are centers. Any more questions before we move on to the other place types? There's a lot here, I understand that, and this is not your last chance to ask questions. We're going to come back to this again as we move forward. All right, the second types of place types are special uses. They include both institutional uses like Tidewater Community College, or industrial and logistics uses like what goes into the corporate landing business park. The special use is not applied to any single small parcel. It's applied to larger parcels that have institutional and industrial logistics uses on them. So typically 10 acres, the place types have more than 10 acres, whether it's institutional or industrial or logistics. What we've done is, you all are familiar with the SEGAs, the strategic economic growth areas, the SEGAs. They are outlined in the existing 2016 comprehensive plan. The policies that are in the existing comprehensive plan are very consistent with the place type policies, that place type design guidelines, objectives and design guidelines that we have in chapter 2. So they get brought in as designated industrial and logistics centers. That's all the blue areas that you see on the map. The blue areas pretty much surround Oceana. And again, these are the SEGA areas that are in the 2016 plan. And then there's the possibility of Burton Station. What could happen up in Burton Station? Burton Station is in an area where there is a lot of industrial around it already. It's a multimodal hub with the airport adjacent to it. Good access into 264, good access onto 13, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. So that may be a place where the city can start looking towards expanding its industrial and logistics opportunities. The policies for the institutional place type, they're going to probably more align with the centers are going to there's gonna be a larger disconnect, I think, between the centers and existing zoning than there will between the institutional place types and the zoning for those particular areas that's already in place. So I'm not gonna get into too much, in terms of that. If you're doing a development within one of these designated special use areas, the design guidelines are there to help augment whatever's in the zoning ordinance. But again, I don't think there's gonna be too many big, huge discrepancies between the two. If the development comes in as more than 10 acres, then it could be designated as an institutional or an industrial logistics place type, and then use the design guidelines for the rezoning of that particular piece of property. Again, so that the city has something to go on in terms of the rezoning and how the rezoning is put together. We talked about the Segas. What I really want to talk about is we have heard that the city needs to look for additional land for industrial and logistics development. It's best if that land is in a place that's on a designated freight corridor, and I'll talk about the freight corridor. I talked about them last time, but I'll talk about them again tonight. What's around Oceana makes a whole lot of sense. Like I said before, Burton Station may be another place where that could take place. And the Navy, I've heard, has tried to lease some of its land around Oceana, so exploring those options with the Navy may be something that the city will not pursue. So those are special use types. Any questions about those?
So how was the 10 acres arrived at? As far as what went into thinking that we should cobble together at least 10 acres in order to do it?
Now, that is something where there's not a ton of science going on. 10 acres is a nice,
It's a nice number.
but I
Right.
pulled out of the air. I
We
mean,
might have a lot of like 7-acre locations, and not a single 10-acre.
yeah,
I mean-
it could be.
I mean, I guess if you're gonna like pick a number, then I'd like to understand it's associated with some research that we've done on trying to find those opportunities in the city and recognize that they actually exist.
So there was a little bit of science going on. I did go and I looked at different industrial institutional properties in the city and figured out how many acres there were in those properties. I think, I can't remember, it's been a while since I looked at it, but corporate research, no, Tidewater Community College, I think is about 10 acres, probably a little bit more than that. But there was, there's a difference between a school, neighborhood school, 3 or 4 acres, and a community college. So that's, I mean, and the 10 acres does not necessarily have to be hard and fast in terms of the intent is to demonstrate that, you don't want to necessarily apply this designation on a 2-acre site where somebody does some industrial development. It's a place where it's got some significance to it. But we can certainly go back and revisit that if we need to. All right, neighborhoods. Here, the importance in terms of objectives is making sure that neighborhoods provide safety, that they have good housing conditions. There is a sense of well-being within the communities. I mean, within the neighborhoods. We talked about this last time, we defined 2 different neighborhood types. Type 1 neighborhoods are those zoning districts within the city that only allow single-family homes. And we use the zoning districts to define the type 1 versus type 2 neighborhoods. So there's type 1 neighborhoods just have single-family homes in them. They could have small-scale civic uses like elementary school or a church. Like what you're looking at the top of the screen is Kings Grant area, and you can see the middle 7-Eleven there, the Masonic Lodge. I guess it's still there. Type 2 neighborhoods, they are allowed by the current zoning to have a mix of dwelling units within them and small scale and civic retail uses. Here with the neighborhoods, the zoning ordinance is gonna hold sway likely. There's some things that the design guidelines, may push a little bit, but it's gonna be the zoning ordinance that dictates what goes on within, neighborhoods. What you're seeing on the map, the light yellow, are all the neighborhoods, residential areas in the city that, allow only single-family homes. That's the light yellow. And then the darker browns on this particular map are all the zoning ordinance districts that allow a mix of housing types. So again, this is very much tied to existing zoning. The neighborhoods are tied to existing zoning. The big thing here is just make sure that the neighborhoods are properly protected from adjacent centers as they develop their special use areas, and the buffering guidelines for centers and special use areas between those areas and neighborhoods are in the design guidelines, so you should take a look at that. One of the ideas, Brian, that you brought up earlier, last time we got together, was, does the city monitor neighborhoods in terms of well-being, health and safety?
Report card sort of thing.
I thought that was a pretty good idea, so that's in here.
Oh. Follow up on something earlier.
Yeah.
Have we, and I don't know if this has been rejected by planners, custody planners, but have we looked at introducing some retail into these mature neighborhoods to reduce the need to leave the neighborhood for certain essentials, to bring basic stores in, create zones of commercial activity within mature? Is that part of this in any way?
That's probably, within an existing neighborhood, that's probably gonna push it a little bit too much to try to introduce that kind of use into an existing neighborhood. It's a good idea, and again, you're ahead of me here, so we keep staying like 2 steps ahead. I'll get to that in just a second, which is the concept, yeah.
Comment on that, the concept of redevelopment and mixed use, so as to allow more condensed areas where people don't have to jump in a car constantly, live, work, play, that kind of concept, and also to attract younger people to stay in Hampton Roads, because a lot of younger people are not enthralled with our neighborhoods the way they're set up, and they're delaying marriage, and they aren't having children, and they want something different. And that means our employers need different places. They're going to Charlotte. So I love all of this. And East Beach has done a great job of integrating in Norfolk, of integrating select retail. There's a Montessori school, there's a sandwich shop, there's a wine shop. There are a couple little things right in there among all the $1 million homes, and it works great. But if you say that in Virginia Beach, I'm gonna tell you, the homeowners here are gonna be all over anybody who says it. Because for some reason, they seem to have a belief that single-family homes are the American dream and don't mess with my neighborhood. Even though you say, I love Virginia Beach also, I want to make it wonderful for everyone and for future generations. And then where we're going now, we don't really have a plan. So we're trying to put a plan for the future. And they'll still say, don't mess with my neighborhood. We took a lot of heat recently for a mixed-use building on Virginia Beach Boulevard, but there were houses behind it. And I don't know why it's such a hot button, but it is. And I don't know how we're going to overcome that.
So, good concept, how it plays out. Let me go through that here, because it's a good concept, but we're proposing that it plays out a little bit differently here. Instead of being exact, that little, I love the way you described it, that little shop, the farmer's market. I mean, when we were doing the focus groups, we heard a lot of that. When we said
Could be
farmer's
an
market.
orthopedist.
Excuse me?
Could be an orthopedist to take care of all the people walking around.
done at East Beach so effectively. It's done in certain places.
So, and this is the whole idea behind communities and community hubs. A community, and the interesting thing about Virginia Beach is, I know this place pretty well. And if somebody tells me, oh, it's over in Great Neck, I know where I'm going. It's over in Little Neck, I know where I'm going. It's over in Bayside, I know where I'm going. It's Kempsville, down in Salem, I know where I'm going. So there are these understood community identities that are out there. And what we're proposing is to more definitively bring those identities out. We've put together a map of what the community boundaries could be. You can see Great Neck, Little Neck, Bayside, Kempsville. These are not final by any stretch of the imagination. The city would go out and start working with the neighborhoods within each of these communities. And understanding, how would you define the community and have a better way of just understanding from people living in the communities what comes together quite naturally for them. The reason why that's important is I think and again, we've heard this quite a bit from our focus groups, that ability to have a community identity, not only neighborhood identities, but community identities. Can you brand, for instance, the Kempsville community in a way that there's a logo that's understood, that reflects what Kempsville is all about. And when you go into Kempsville, you see that branding in the gateway going into the Kempsville community. In prominent places within the community, you see that brand so people can identify with what's going on and where they are within the city itself. Because the city can be overwhelming. You get back into Kempsville and you kind of know you're there. This can help in terms of branding different parts of the city. So that's step one of what we're talking about. Step two is working with the communities within these defined communities and saying, where can we put community hubs? These places that you're talking about, centrally located within the community, where people can go when they don't have to go miles and miles to get there. And what's really important is the ability to get to these community hubs by biking or by walking, and not necessarily having to get in the car to get there. So again, that the locations for these places have to be identified and determined. Some of them I think are already kind of there, like Kempsville. It's got I don't know what you call it, downtown Kempsville maybe, where my brother's church is. Excuse me?
We talked about stuff,
Yeah.
the historic Kempsville area. This is,
Historic Kempsville. So anyway, so that gives you a flavor of what we're talking about, but more pedestrian oriented and place when you get there by bike or by walking, you're there, you can walk through it and again, do the farmer's market, small scale shopping, the weekend concert, local concert, something that sort of brings the community together. And then what's interesting, there's all sorts of community activities that take place already. My nephew's sons play football, they go to the Little League games and they all get together at this is Great Neck Middle School now, it used to be Cox High School, but so people are already getting together at the community level, and this just sort of solidifies those relationships. They go to church together, not at the neighborhood level, but at the community level. So start pulling these ideas together. So that's the idea of the community hubs. That is something that will have to be built from the ground up, but I think would be a very intriguing thing for the city to do. Least fun of all the place types, or these are quarter types, are the quarter types, which are regional multimodal, city multimodal, and freight. We talked about these last time, but regional multimodal corridors are places that allow walking and biking and transit. And potentially over the long term, they could accommodate premium transit. And when I say premium transit, I'm talking about a transit vehicle that operates in its own right of way. It could be bus rapid transit, it could be light rail transit. There's some options there. Bus rapid transit comes in a lot of different flavors. And I might get into the details of that right now. City multimodal corridors, again, they're intended to be walkable, bikeable, but they're not going to have premium transit. There's just never going to be enough ridership on these corridors to generate that kind of potential, but they should be oriented to fixed bus transit that's out there right now. And you should be able to get to from where you are to where you need to get to along these corridors with transit in a way that makes sense and is safe and convenient. Freight corridors, it's a whole different thing. Freight corridors really are focused in on delivering truck traffic into these logistic and industrial areas. So these are the corridor locations. The brown corridors are the regional corridors, multimodal corridors. Virginia Beach Boulevard, we've already talked about that. You know, the city had thought about putting light rail, extending the tide system all the way to the beach, but that referendum, there's a referendum, there's a vote, not that happened, but that's still a possibility out there. Whether it happens or not, again, that's not something this comprehensive plan is weighing in on. What this comprehensive planning is saying is ultimately this could be a corridor for premium transit. The other one that I think is pretty interesting is connecting from town center down to the municipal center down Princess Anne Road as a regional corridor. More long-term in terms of what can happen on that particular corridor. Virginia Beach would definitely be the first, Boulevard would be the first. The blue, light blue areas, lines on this are city corridors. Include Great Neck and First Colonial, Independence, North Town Center, Witch Duck, and Indian River Road over to Lynn Haven, and Lynn Haven back up to Virginia Beach Boulevard, and then General Booth. And you can see the tie between those corridors and the centers that we've identified. So that's the connection, that ladies transportation connection. The dark gray are the freight corridors, and again, they're going through pretty much this existing industrial areas, either around the base, the Naval Air Station, or up near Norfolk International Airport. The objectives for multimodal corridors is support multimodal transportation. We have to make sure that whatever happens in comprehensive plan needs to be coordinated with the master transportation plan the city's putting together right now. The policy is really going to need to do a multimodal study of Virginia Beach Boulevard. And I talked about this last time. The reason why that study needs to happen is because there's other people involved on Virginia Beach Boulevard. It's not just the city, it's the state, it's the region, the MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization for the region. That's where most of the money probably is going to come from for any kind of improvements. So that plan starts coordinating all these different entities. And again, with the comprehensive plan that has these land use policies embedded in it, you can make a stronger case to the state or to the region why multimodal investments are important for this corridor. Yeah.
So have you taken the 20-year comp plan, Norfolk, Chesapeake, and lined them outside the lines of that rendering that we just looked at on that map that we just saw,
Yeah.
to show those regional corridors where they're connecting in the planning of these neighboring cities, understanding we're a region trying to grow together with some semblance of coordination through Hampton Roads Planning or whoever is coordinating this? How is that done?
Well, they do have a long-range transportation plan, and so we know what's in the long-range transportation
For
plan
each city or for
for
the
the region.
region?
Yeah, it's called Hampton Roads Long-Range Transportation Plan. It's something that you have to do by federal law. It's updated every 5 years, and so we've taken a look at that plan. I think that at the regional level, there's two things that I think are really important for Virginia Beach. One is the tide is already up and running along, Virginia Beach Boulevard in Norfolk. So that's a multimodal corridor that's already been established. And really, I think that's the only robust multimodal corridor in the region right now is that. So this could be an extension to the east of that. And that was the concept behind what was proposed a few years back. The other, I think, and we're going to talk about this when we get into the environmental section in the linear park system, It's the regional trail system that's getting created. The Virginia, in fact, I saw a really nice, Walter, I know you're out there somewhere, presentation Walter did for the RAC a few weeks ago about the Virginia Beach Trail. So it's going to be important not only to the city, and this is his words, and I agree with him, but to the region. I mean, and even beyond. He was talking about the connection all the way across the country into the Virginia Beach Trail, to the ocean front, having that place where people can go to and end their journey and they're going cross country. How anybody can do that's beyond me, but more power to them right across the country. But I think there's some other possibilities. There's a coastal trail that goes along Shore Drive and Atlantic Boulevard that could be developed. And there's some other trails, and again, I'm not gonna get too far into the details there. But those are the only regional connections I think that we've been paying attention to. Nothing else really stood out to us in terms of what the city needed to be paying attention to at the regional level.
The way I was looking at this page, I guess slide 47, was that you were attempting to direct these city corridors into these regional corridors and connect the regional corridors beyond the limits of the jurisdiction. So
Yes.
that's why I was curious to know how we tied into those, if it's through Princess Anne going south or, obviously 264, how are we doing that,
Yeah, excuse me, the multimodal component of Virginia Beach Boulevard, as I said before, that ties into the tie system. How that actually would tie into the tie system is to be determined, but that investment's already there. You can see the freight corridors, they kind of line up with 264 and 64. You do want that regional access for trucks coming in and out of the city. And that's why they're organized the way they are. The city, the blue lines on this map, the city corridors really are intended for citywide, for city, intra-city travel, not so much regional travel. And that's why, part of the reason why they're designated as city corridors as opposed to regional corridors. Because for instance, Independence Boulevard really does not connect to anything outside the city, except how it intersects with Virginia Beach Boulevard. Okay, good. I'll stop right there and ask you all have any questions before we get into the chapter 5. I appreciate your patience. A lot of density here. Okay, so we're moving into the coastal context area. Again, by the numbers, the coverage. I was initially surprised to see that 30% of the whole area, and let me quickly give you the map of what we're talking about. Coastal context area pretty much goes from Little Creek over to First Landing State Park and then down to Sandbridge to the south. So it's up against the Atlantic and Chesapeake Bay. And at first I was thinking 30% of parks, and then I got, well, First Landing is there, and that's probably the reason why it's 30% parks. Military bases, it's really interesting. Some of your prime real estate on the ocean and on the bay is owned by the government, military operations. That's an important economic generator. 19% residential, 15% other, water, roads, utilities, and things like that. Even less vacant land here. And John, it's a little bit here, a little bit there. It's not as suburban as the inland area. It's got some really interesting character to both the developments, within the area, the resort area in particular, but the neighborhoods, most of the neighborhoods, very, very unique characters to each one of them. Although there's some common features if you think about those neighborhoods, what's going on in Shore Drive. There's some things there that you see that are similar to what you see in the North End, which are similar to what you see in the resort area, which are similar to what you see down at Sandbridge. They're all embracing the beachfront. There's more of a mix of housing types going on. There is more commercial, retail, civic stuff going on within these neighborhoods than there are in the more traditional, won't call them traditional, but the neighborhoods in the inland area. And there's street grids, that's kind of interesting, a lot of street grids. Somebody's had enough? You know, I think just that relationship to the ocean front and to the bay front, you know, it's an ecologically important place. It's vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. You know, it's what draws people to Virginia Beach, tourists to Virginia Beach. It will absorb a portion of the city's growth, but not much. It is going to be primarily in the resort area. And again, that notion of enhancing the walking and biking that's already out there and making sure that the neighborhoods are safe and healthy. In terms of the place types, here they are. The centers really, the big center is the resort area. And there's a resort area strategic action plan that's been put together. This is not going, this kind of comprehensive plan embraces that plan that's already been put together. There's been some complementary plans that have been put together for the race app, like resort area mobility plan. So, and that will continue. There's going to be other studies that are done as is recommended in the race app. So I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. I think one of the areas that we have to pay a little bit more attention to, and we try to, is the neighborhoods that are going on. There are neighborhoods within the race app, like Shadow Lawn and some name is escaping me, the area around 24th Street. These are pretty nice little neighborhoods, and so it's not just those neighborhoods have to have the race app. I think does not give them their proper due. I'm not getting after the race app, but the race app, we can augment what's in the race app with regards to those neighborhoods. And there's some issues in those neighborhoods that we need to deal with. So again, the race app and the guidelines within the campus plan to guide development in that area. We've already talked about the options in terms of what's going on. And there's another center that's already pretty much built out. It's up at Shore Drive and Great Neck Road that we've designated, and it's already a pretty mixed use kind of place. So the idea here was that center would not necessarily grow too much in terms of development, but how can you reformat it to make it more walkable? Because it is bisected by two major roads. I think the big focus here is on the neighborhoods, the coastal neighborhoods. This slide didn't have much on it because this is an idea that just sort of, you know, we sat and we were talking about it. And maybe what we need to do is we have a type 1 neighborhood, we have a type 2 neighborhood. We probably should have a coastal neighborhood, a place type that's designed specifically for coastal neighborhoods and the unique conditions in the neighborhood. So we just thought about that maybe a week ago, and we need to flesh that out. We'll put whatever we come up with into chapter 2, and you'll have a chance to see that. But that is to be developed. And again, the neighborhoods along Shore Drive, North End, within the resort area itself, the Sand Bridge. Same kind of thing. What's interesting about the communities in the coastal area is they're already pretty much defined. When you say I'm going to Chicks Beach, you know where you're going to. When they're going to Sandbridge, you know where you're going to. Or North End, you know where you're going to. And they're fairly well defined. So, and they've got some branding to them already, but just getting more clear about what that branding feature in the neighborhoods could be. And again, displaying that branding as you go in the community and you get to prominent places within community. Big deal here is the walking, you know, and again, there's in most of these communities, there's already community hubs that are there. So how can you perfect those community hubs? Now, Sandbridge, I don't know if you call it a community hub or not, but you've got that little Sandbridge market at the north end, a little bit of commercial up there, and you've got a little bit of stuff going down near the park, the south end. So not central, but that's what we're trying. I mean, these places already have some activities going on with each of these. And so how do you perfect those communities hubs? And again, how do you improve walking and biking connectivity from the different houses within the community into these community hubs, or just throughout the entire, community area. I mean, I saw the other day, I was driving up Atlantic, and these two girls were walking with traffic right on the shoulder of Atlantic, and almost got hit by some cars. So, there's some things that can be done, to improve walkability in these communities. And again, Quarters, is really, it's the eastern end of the Virginia Beach Boulevard corridor, and then Shorter Drive and Atlantic Avenue make up the other multi-level quarters, here. All right, so that's chapter 4 and 5. Any thoughts, final thoughts, questions on the first two chapters? I know you're going to need to absorb it. We'll have a chance to come back and revisit.
I hear comments from locals that say our oceanfront is quite developed and that there isn't room for Virginia Beach citizens who don't live on the water. So when a hotel goes up for sale, the city doesn't have money, or I don't believe the city has appetite to purchase that and leave it apart for open space for people to come. And the small hotels are getting taken down and replaced by big hotels. So we're starting to look more and more like Miami Beach. I don't know any way around it. Did you give any thought to the waterfront and how the people who live inland can take ownership of that and enjoy that? Not just the tourists, because tourists have plenty of access, but the locals.
Yeah. When we were talking in the focus groups and in public meetings, we heard that a lot.
I hear it.
We don't feel like the beach is ours.
Right.
And then the question is, my follow-up question is why? Most of them thought the parking was atrocious, to go down there and park, to do anything, it just wasn't worth all the effort to do that. So parking is a big part of it. No place for locals really to be except to be on the beach itself. So the central beach plan is being put together right now, and one of the key tenets of that plan is to create, and this is the plan that's covering the area, convention center down to actually down to Norfolk Avenue to the south. On the east it would be Mediterranean, probably not too far east, and on the west, Burbank Road. And what we heard again in that, when we were talking with people about what had happened, this should be a place for locals to go and be like a main street, if you will, for locals. They also recognize that, because of the convention center and sports tourism, that had to be part of the mix, but just a place for locals to be. So one of the things we're paying attention to is, where are the gathering spots for locals wanting to go here, be a year-round spot for them to be. And parking is going to be a big part of that whole strategy. And how can you properly put parking into this place where people can come and park and easily get to the places in there that they need to get to. So that's just part of the overall solution, but I just wanted to relay that to you. And that plan is still, we're still working on that, and probably a month away.
Yeah, I have a direct follow from that, because that will so change the view of the comp plan. If we proceed, and it's my understanding, it's coming up soon, potentially right before we even pass the comp plan, we could be considering the Central Beach plan. That is a plan for 10,000 residential units in my district, which is coastal, okay? Well, if you go to chapter 4 for the inland area, it is to absorb most of the anticipated future development. And that is 40,000 residents, new residents over 20 years, that's 20,000 units. So we're really talking about putting 10,000 of those units under this one plan that's coming before us in advance of our comp plan. Doesn't that alter already the plan that we're putting all of our efforts into? And how do we fold them together to make sense out of them, so that we address these concerns together and not already be out of whack with the plan that we're trying to adopt here. And you may not have an easy answer to that, because everything is a draft, everything is a potential until it gets nailed down, don't know. But to understand that plan as it coincides with our comp plan, because it's so dramatic, I think it's very important, if we're going to be considering it soon, that we have it sooner rather than later. Because it already changes the inland the context area for the inland zone as not absorbing most of the growth of the future of the city. Because you put 10,000 units down there with all the adjoining, residential, commercial, and mixed uses, and the green space that's planned for it. I think it gets to what you're saying. I mean, it has a lot of the, places that people are going to want to go to and enjoy, hopefully, worked into that plan. But I think it modifies what we're looking at citywide, quite dramatically. So I'm confused by that. I don't know how to contend with it, in this process, and how it's going to come about in logical way that we can explain and understand.
No, I think that's a good point, and we do need to fold those two things together, so, which we will do. Any more questions on 4 and 5?
I've got a question. You mentioned that, the developers from Charlotte that are doing stuff down there don't really have an appetite to come here. And I've heard similar in the architecture community, but Charlotte doesn't have a lot of space to develop inside of Charlotte. So how do they overcome that and attract those kinds of development you were talking about?
Charlotte did a number of things. It's a pretty interesting case study, and I'm not going to get into all the details of Charlotte. But one of the things, the whole idea of place types, I think, was born in Charlotte. It was back in 1990. They said we need to define the Charlotte region by place types as opposed to land uses, because their focus back when they were doing this plan was on economic development and how do they compete on the worldwide stage. And so they knew that they had to have a world-class airport, and they also had to have a good transit system. So they were sort of shooting for transit from the get-go. And they realized in order to plan for transit, you had to think about land uses, and you had to think about place types as a way of thinking about land use. So I think the difference between Charlotte and this region is that they led with transit, and then that their development is transforming along these corridors where they actually have invested in transit, like the Blue Line. So that was a very deliberate strategy on their part to help catalyze development, which is very similar to what happened in Arlington. Arlington said, we're going to pay that extra $380 million because they wanted economic development to happen in Arlington County. They didn't want to go out to Fairfax and Vienna and all those places out west. They realized the way they could compete was, in terms of regional economic development, was to have transit access in those places. Transit really can be. We've done work with people that do market analysis on transit corridors. And transit can be a real economic development generator. So, back to, you were talking about the growth that happens. I mean, the growth we're using is projected by the Weldon Center. And it's really not a lot of growth. I mean, it's not the big, massive growth that the beach has seen in the past. And I think that's because the beach is running out of land. But to me, what's happening, not that I'm trying to promote growth, but when you start putting these things together, you will attract a different kind of growth. And one of the examples, I can use Charlotte, I can use Arlington. There's a Euclid corridor in Cleveland that they branded as the medical corridor. Goes up and down Euclid Boulevard, and they've got a whole lot of economic development in Cleveland happening along that corridor. So transit can be a real economic generator, and I think that's in line with what the city wants to do with this economic development plan. But you don't necessarily you gotta do is you gotta put all the pieces together so that they add up to a whole when you get to the end of the day. Okay, it's getting late, so I'm gonna ask, we've got a few comments on, chapters 1 and 2. Any other comments that you all want to bring up now, or? I've worn out my welcome.
I sent mine via email, but I'm happy to. I'm concerned that this requires a lot of private buy-in. And I don't know that we'll have it or that we'll have it in a timely fashion. I think it's wonderful to have a plan that's aspirational, but somehow we're going to have to incentivize those property owners. And I think we need to give heavy consideration to that. Otherwise, it's not going to work, as I see it. So if it's tax holidays or what it is, we're going to have to do something to incentivize the landowners and the redevelopers to share this vision. So that was my one big concern. And then my other big concern was how do we phase it in with the big boxes and the out parcels? Because I think every time we approve a conditional use permit or something that's a little bit better than is there, but it's still old school, we're perpetuating the old. And we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. We're not moving with this, which maybe that's what we have to do. I mean, I know change comes slowly, but we're talking, another 20 years from decisions we're making today.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why this comprehensive plan is getting set up the way it is, so like cities putting a stake in the ground saying this is the direction we're going in. It's different than what it's been in the past. And, whether the private market responds to that or not is to be seen. But at least the city is defining what it wants to do moving forward. And I think that's really important, having clarity about where you're going.
I always think of it like the pilot, this great photograph of the new statue that they put in a roundabout. It's a great roundabout.
Yeah.
And right to the eye of the statue is the Burger King sign. And, but the Burger King's been there forever, and it makes a ton of money for the owner, and it's not something you can just wipe off the face of the earth, take away their hopes and dreams, to do well at that site, because we're the Republic of Virginia Beach is coming in and run you out of town. So there is this fine balance. It's a very delicate one. So I really want to drill down. You say, how do we bring the private folks along? I think we have to drill down and understand this information. Why are we drawing these boundaries like this? Why are we setting these parameters this way? We can't readily answer this question. I'm not sure I know how to sell the plan. How we arrive at that. We have general ideas that float around in our mind. But the specifics are really what pull us along. We know it's to get to the tide down in Norfolk, and we need to push that, that's concrete. But if it's something like, well, we have a regional corridor, where you're going outside of this region, we don't know. We don't know what's on the other side of that line, the city boundary. It's much harder to communicate and to even personally understand why these choices are being made. So I know the consultants do a great job in understanding it and working towards creating these SGAs, and they inherit the SGAs, and now they're defining them further. But I think we have to flesh it out more. It takes a lot of discussion with such a diverse city with so much going on to understand.
There's a lot here. I will agree with you there.
I'm not sure if this is a question for you or for Kathy Warren, and maybe it's just me and I'm dense, but I hear conflicting comments about light rail still. I mean, we're at almost 2025 and I'm still hearing you say, oh, well, light rail's not now, but maybe in the future. I really don't understand that. And then I also hear how the BB Trail is so exciting and we're going to develop around it. I don't know which of you can comment on that, but I'd like to know where we are on it.
On the Virginia Beach Trail?
On that piece of land.
So, and I'll start, you can add in if you want, stuff, if you want to add in, you know, light rail, we know what the referendum said. If it ever comes back again, who knows? We are leaving in the design enough room for some type of transit to get through that area. Whether it's bus rapid transit, whether it's, micro transit, whether it's light rail. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that right now, but we are thinking that. And we are talking about setting up zoning in such a way along the trail so that it's not transit oriented development, but it's trail oriented development. So there's plenty of examples out there where trails have been established, zoning's put in place so that buildings all of a sudden are fronting the trail. And there are places for people to stop along the way, those types of things. I don't know where we are with light rail, if it ever comes back again. I'm hearing the same thing as you are. Some people very supportive, some people never want to see it.
With that question, because I'm on the section of the trail where all of Dominion is doing the heavy upgrade of its transmission line, and that is gonna go all the way down. Is that fair to assess?
And so,
And it's ginormous. I mean, those things are like,
done.
that is quite a lane that they're gonna be taking for just the Dominion power line coming down. So
Upgrading all of their lines.
it looks less trail like.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, if you know, just speaking about the trail quickly, if you look at that Pembroke SGA picture that you showed earlier, this was done how many years ago? And you see the pedestrian bridge there. So there's been a vision for a very long time that people never thought it was going to happen. And we're sitting here, what, 20 years later, and we're going to start to see something that happen. It's the same thing with the race app. Did you think that you'd see that much multifamily development in the resort area as we've seen it the last 10, 15 years? Yeah.
I thought there'd be a lot more, frankly, but you know, I mean, just in the going vertical hope, you know, I thought there would be more to take the stress off of these on the water properties, create more of a buffer along our water line, more resiliency along our water line. I mean, I'm seeing it. I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree with it. You know, these things will take a lot of time. I have to ask these questions because I'm trying to fold this together in my head to know, you know, that we are creating a comprehensible.
Totally agree. We all have to be there. Got it. Or it doesn't work. But it's a vision, and we've done it on a smaller scale. We have the race app that within the OR district calls for mixed use. And so the Central Beach, that's in the OR, and that's what you're seeing this board drilled down plan. Saying, yes, mixed uses should go here.
Well, I think that's a good point. I want to go off on that point because if this Central Beach is actually going to happen, and I mean, the landowners sell the land, it's going to be, you know, all the infrastructure, all of that, that comes with opportunity. So that opportunity comes right square in the middle of our comp plan. You know, it wasn't there for many years and all of a sudden the forces change. And now here it comes. And it requires us to be flexible enough to realize, okay, well, if we want that, this is no longer. These strategies are going to have to be modified. So I think that's what is occurring. That's the sense I get, but it's very important for me to kind of reconcile it all.
I don't want to hog the time, so other commissioners should feel free to interrupt me. But when I saw public-private partnerships, it concerned me. So what I would hope would that there would be opportunities for public investment in private development, and that it would be uniform and available to everyone. And I would hope that it would not be just a few developers. I think the city of Virginia Beach has had, whether it's earned or not, they've had a bad reputation in the past for having a few select developers who reap the benefits of public-private ventures. So whatever we do, I'd like it to be uniform and available to everyone.
Okay, going once. Oh, go ahead.
As far as infrastructure is concerned, for shopping centers and residential development, the whole, everything, what consideration is given for the charging of electric vehicles? As far as design? Is that even a thought, or that's just gonna take care of itself if it comes along?
I don't know if it will take care of itself. That's a good point you raised.
The city is doing a study right now, and they're actually mapping out where all of those EV stations should go throughout the city and how it gets funded.
Well, I mean, we talked about these regional centers and city centers and neighborhoods. If, let's say we're gonna, knock down a neighborhood, or we're gonna knock down a military center, Pembroke Mall, or whatever you want to say, we're gonna start again. Would charging stations be primary consideration, all that kind of, I mean,
I think they work part and parcel with, as I said earlier, where you put parking is going to be extremely important. You got to strategically locate it. And I think parking goes hand in hand with the charging stations that you're talking about. So it's a thought that we've got to put into our thinking.
and as far as, I guess, commercial development, just to put it under one heading, big block stores. Seems to me that that thought needs to be, that's changing rapidly with the advent of Amazon, the auto.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as having a big anchor out parcel, that concept is pretty much going by the wayside, isn't it?
Oh, it has. So what we're proposing, and to me, that's the opportunity, is because retail is just so fundamentally changing. What do you do with all that, the big boxes out there that are struggling to stay alive? And so and that's what we're proposing in the plan, as you go into those commercial areas, those big box areas. It's pretty inexpensive development to start with. It's not something that you can't rip down, according to my brother who knows about these things. So it's not, the market's not there for big box retail. A lot of empty space around for the parking. The buildings aren't worth that much to begin with. So to me, and we heard this when we were going around the city talking about how the city should grow. A lot of people talked about this is where we need to grow along these corridors where these big box retails are. So you don't put another big box retail in where one's currently existing, to your point. What you need to do is you need to think through, okay, how can we get other businesses in here? How do we get residences, homes in here, multifamily homes? But do it in a way that makes the place come together in a cohesive way and allows people to walk and enjoy the place. Just a little apartment complex over here that's not connected to another little apartment complex that's right next to it, pull it all together so people can work their way through it. It's a cohesive place.
And how about, and to tie that in further, how about the fact that everybody's gonna be working?
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah, and that is changing, the amount of commercial office space. It's really going down, so we anticipate there's still quite a few businesses that want their employees to be in the office, but as a rule or as a trend, that's going down. So we need to factor that into how this put together.
Thank you.
Are we tackling environmental next? Is that the subject next?
No, we're gonna get to that at the end there. That's gonna be at our last meeting on 30th, is that right?
Yes.
I would ask, the city spent about $3.5 million studying very large stormwater projects around the city,
Okay.
before 2020, something like that. I've never seen them discussed as ever being potentially integrated into our plan. And if they were, how would it affect, any of the zones that we're considering? If there's appetite for them, is that going to be part of this?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a really important part of it. I'll give you a sneak peek. I can get back there. So we're at the very beginning. I think you're referring to the Sea Level Wise program.
Yes, in part, that
In part.
was what came out of it, but there were a number of potentially large projects like the Lesnar Seawall
Yeah, yeah.
and some of these others that were just,
So what you're seeing on this map, I think there are 4 strategies that came out of that. One was, can't remember all the strategies, so I apologize. One was, I remember 3 of the 4, so that's pretty good for me. One was to enhance existing open spaces and natural areas that will be prone to flooding. So what you're seeing in the light greens and the dark greens on the map are those areas that are going to be prone to flooding now and in the future. So what do you do with all that land? You got to protect it. Second is any dwelling units, any buildings within the potential flood areas, make them more resilient so they can withstand flooding. And then the third, engineered solutions is what you're talking about. You see those red lines on the map? That's the Western gates up there on Chesapeake Bay. You can see the seawall along Atlantic, the boardwalk actually, and then that real extensive system of seawalls and gates around Back Bay and Sand Bridge. So what we have done is we said, okay, what's really important here, of most importance, is protecting the places that are already within the floodplain areas. That's that second strategy. But going back to the first strategy in terms of enhancement, the thought there was, what if you took all these green areas and you just started really figuring out how can you protect those green areas in some way, shape, or form, either through easements, through purchases of the lands, because they're not going to be worth anything with the flooding that's going to be coming anyway. So anticipate that's happening. So now you start connecting all these natural systems and parks together. That's where the environmental framework started taking some life to it. What if we can connect all these places, not only for flooding purposes, but to connect habitats together and then actually give people some citywide parks and trails and things that they can move along. Because these places aren't always going to be flooded. And that's where the linear park system came. So all that is talked about. It's the big idea that collectively we came up with. The environmental framework, really, the genesis of that was this plan here.
I guess they were called like the Burberry studies. It was the
Yeah. Dewberry.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, I'm trying to remember, it's been 4 or 5 years ago when they were probably that, maybe longer than that. But we've spent a lot of money on it. I've not heard much about it, but are those referenced in this? Okay.
Very much so, yeah. They're like the foundational pieces of the environmental chapter.
Okay.
Nice coats, though.
Did I miss, were there 4 strategies?
In the Dewberry?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's 4 in there. I was actually thinking about the Army Corps of Engineers report recently, and if you're taking that into context here.
City and the Army Corps did a webinar last week on seawall and flooding.
Take a look at that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's go one twice. I think we're going. So, thank you. Thank you.
It's, interested in development.
They were